The German shepherd barked at the old coffin. What came out made everyone's blood run cold. From the footsteps of a child to the quiet strength of a loyal dog, this is a story about faith, courage, and second chances. But tell us, has an animal ever changed your life in ways you couldn't forget? If so, share your memory below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. The storm rolled over the small town like an angry drumbeat, shaking windows and rattling the loose tin roofs of old barns. Lightning flashed across the sky, throwing sharp shadows against the worn headstones of the cemetery at the edge of town. Most people stayed inside on nights like this, tucked safely behind warm walls and glowing lamps. But out in the rain, a single figure sat unmoving. A German shepherd with eyes fixed on something hidden in the earth. The dog's fur was soaked, his body trembling not from the cold but from a fierce energy that seemed to pour out of him. He wasn't wandering or lost. He had chosen this place, this very spot where an old coffin had been partly unearthed by the storm's pounding rain. Its edges of which showed through the mud, weathered and darkened with age. And there, in front of it, the shepherd barked with every ounce of his being. Each sound echoed across the cemetery like thunder, shaking the quiet of the night. At first, no one paid attention. After all, dogs bark for many reasons. But the sound didn't fade. It grew sharper, more desperate, as if the animal was trying to speak in the only way he knew. Soon, lights flickered on in houses near the graveyard. Curtains were pulled back, faces pressed to windows. Curiosity overcame fear, and slowly, one by one, people stepped out into the storm, clutching coats and lanterns as they followed the sound of the dog's cries. The cemetery was a place most avoided after dark. Stories had been told for generations, of voices carried in the wind, of shadows moving between the stones when no one should have been there. Children were warned not to wander too close. But on this night, the people of the town found themselves drawn, as if the dog's voice carried not just urgency but command. By the time they reached the graveyard, the shepherd was pawing at the muddy earth, circling the half-buried coffin with frantic energy. His chest heaved, his growl rumbled low between barks, his eyes glowing with something more than instinct. He was guarding, warning, begging them to notice what he had already sensed. The townsfolk gathered in silence, their lanterns casting trembling light on the leaning gravestones and wild grass. The storm eased for a moment, leaving only the whisper of wind and the heavy sound of rain dripping from trees. The dog did not stop. His voice carried into the stillness with such force that even the bravest among them felt their hearts beat faster. Something was here. Something hidden. An old woman clutched her shawl tighter, whispering a prayer. A farmer wiped rain from his brow and shook his head, muttering that no good ever came from opening the past. The local policeman stepped closer, his jaw tense, trying to keep order though he too felt unease. No one could explain why the shepherd refused to move, why he planted himself in front of the coffin like a soldier on guard. Then the dog let out one long, piercing howl. It rose into the night like a cry of grief and warning all at once, a sound so raw that it made the air itself seem to tremble. In that moment, every person there understood this was no ordinary night and no ordinary dog. The coffin sat before them, its wood cracked, its presence heavy with mystery. And though no one dared to touch it yet, the feeling pressed into every soul. Whatever lay inside was not meant to stay hidden forever. What they would uncover next would make every heart in that small town tremble, and no one would ever look at that graveyard the same way again. The old cemetery lay on the edge of town, quiet and forgotten, like a book left unread on a dusty shelf. Its stones were cracked, names worn away by rain and years. Crosses leaned at odd angles, as if bowing under the weight of time. Wild grass had crept over everything, swallowing paths and curling around the roots of crooked trees. In some places, the earth itself seemed to breathe, sinking and rising with the memory of those long buried beneath. Few people came here anymore. Most avoided it. The older folks told stories, their voices hushed whenever the cemetery came up in conversation. They spoke of graves that should never be disturbed, of families broken by sorrow, of shadows that lingered when they should have gone to rest. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering among the stones, others whispered of hearing cries carried on the wind. Whether true or not, the warning stuck. Parents told their children not to wander near the graves. And yet, on certain days, the air seemed to pull you toward it, heavy with secrets waiting to be uncovered. That evening, as the storm clouds began to fade and the first thin streaks of moonlight slid through the clouds, a small figure appeared at the cemetery gates. A baby girl, barely 3 years old, toddled forward with curious steps. She wore a little blue dress, the color bright even against the gloom. In her tiny hands, she clutched nothing but the hem of her dress, lifting it slightly as she walked through the wet grass. She was not alone. Beside her, towering and steady, walked her German shepherd. His fur, darkened by the rain, glistened in the pale light. His stride was careful, his ears pricked, every movement showing a quiet strength. He was not just a pet, he was her guardian. Wherever she went, he followed, his amber eyes watching the world as if it was his duty to protect her from it. The girl moved with the innocence of a child, unafraid of the crooked stones or the whispering trees. To her, it was a place to explore, a new corner of the world. But the shepherd felt something else. His pace slowed as they crossed deeper into the graveyard. The air seemed heavier here, the silence deeper. The old stones loomed around them, names and dates long forgotten, but each one carrying a story untold. Suddenly, the shepherd stopped. His body stiffened, his head lifted, his nose twitching as if catching a scent buried in the damp earth. The girl stumbled a few steps before she noticed he wasn't following. She turned, her wide eyes searching his face, waiting for him to move. But he didn't. His tail lowered, his fur bristled, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. At his feet lay something strange, something the storm had revealed. Part of the ground had given way, the soil washed aside by the heavy rains. From beneath the mud, the corner of an old wooden coffin jutted out, its edges blackened with time. The wood was split in places, swollen by years of dampness, but still whole enough to hold its secret. It should have been buried deep, hidden from view, but the storm had unearthed it, as though the earth itself wanted it to be found. The girl tilted her head, curious, and reached a tiny hand toward the exposed wood. But before she could touch it, the shepherd barked sharply, the sound cutting through the night like a warning. She pulled her hand back, startled. The dog stepped forward, placing himself between her and the coffin, his body rigid, his eyes locked onto the half-buried box. His barking grew louder, each sound echoing against the stones, until the quiet cemetery no longer felt silent at all. For the girl, there was no fear, only trust. She watched her shepherd with innocent wonder, sensing that whatever he had found mattered. His paws dug lightly at the mud, his nose pressed against the wood, and his voice carried into the night with fierce determination. To anyone else, it might have sounded like noise, but to the child it was clear. Her dog had discovered something that should not be ignored. The wind stirred the tall grass, bending it like waves around the graves. The moon broke free from the clouds, casting a pale light on the scene. The old cemetery, once forgotten and avoided, now felt alive with presence. The broken stones leaned closer, the wild grass whispered louder, as if the ground itself waited for what was about to unfold. The girl held tightly to her dog's fur, her small face pressed against his side. She didn't know why he barked or what lay inside the broken coffin, but she knew one thing with the simple certainty only a child could have. He would not leave until the truth was found. The storm had passed, but something far stronger had been awakened. The shepherd's bark tore through the cemetery air, raw and unrelenting. His body circled the half-buried coffin with a restlessness that unsettled even the bravest heart. He growled low, a deep rumble that vibrated against the earth, then pawed at the wood as if trying to claw away the years that kept it sealed. Each strike of his paw against the softened would send a dull thud echoing into the night. He was not confused, not playful, he was urgent. Something inside that box stirred his instincts, and he would not stop until it was revealed. The little girl in the blue dress stood beside him, clutching a handful of his thick fur. Her tiny fingers buried themselves in his coat as if holding on to him was the only way to feel safe. She didn't cry. Children have a way of sensing truth before words can explain it. She only pressed her cheek against his side, her wide eyes fixed on the coffin he refused to leave. She could feel his heart racing beneath his ribs, faster than normal, thundering with something fierce. His unease became hers. The dog barked again, sharp and commanding, then scratched harder, sending damp clumps of soil scattering. The sound carried far across the graveyard, through the broken stones and leaning crosses, across the wild grass that bent under the cool wind. Soon, it carried beyond the cemetery fence, into the ears of those passing nearby. An old man walking home from the mill stopped in his tracks. He adjusted the lantern in his hand and peered toward the graveyard. "What on earth?" he muttered. The dog's cry wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a call of hunger or boredom. It was different, desperate, warning, almost pleading. Another figure appeared on the road, a woman carrying a basket of bread wrapped in cloth. She paused, hearing the bark, and frowned. "That's Thompson's shepherd, isn't it? Why is he out there making such a ruckus?" she whispered to the man as they leaned toward the cemetery gate. Within minutes, the noise pulled in more eyes and ears. A pair of boys who had been playing with sticks by the ditch crept closer, their laughter fading into nervous silence. A farmer, his boots caked with soil, stopped his wagon to listen. Even a weary grandmother, leaning on her cane, drew near with cautious steps, shaking her head as though she already knew this night would not end quietly. They gathered at the fence, watching. The shepherd's body moved in frantic circles around the coffin, his hackles raised, teeth flashing in the pale moonlight. His nose pressed hard against the split seams of the wood, then he backed up to bark again, the sound rolling across the graves. Each bark felt like an alarm bell, refusing to let them turn away. "Why won't he stop?" whispered the basket woman, clutching the cloth tighter against her chest. Her voice trembled, not from the cold but from the weight of the moment. The farmer shook his head, his weathered face grim. "Dogs don't carry on like that without reason. He knows something's wrong." The children pressed closer to the fence, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "Is someone in there?" one boy whispered, though the words themselves made him shiver. The grandmother's voice cracked through the silence. "Hush, child. The dead belong to their rest. Don't you dare call them back." Her words, though scolding, only added to the unease spreading among the group. The little girl, still clinging to her shepherd, looked up at the gathering faces. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she said nothing. She didn't know the words, only the feeling that her dog was trying to tell them something that mattered. She buried her face in his fur and whispered a soft sound only he could hear, as though giving him permission to keep going. The shepherd pawed harder, his nails screeching against the softened wood. Dirt scattered, grass tore free, and his breath came in heavy pants. He whined between growls, a sorrowful sound that made the townsfolk's skin prickle. He was digging not just with his paws but with his heart, tearing at something invisible as much as at the coffin itself. The crowd began to murmur. "It's cursed," one said. "He's seen a ghost." Another argued, No, he's smelling something foul." But none dared step closer. The dog's urgency held them back. His body, taut and bristling, was like a shield between them and the box in the ground. The grandmother's cane pressed into the earth as she took a hesitant step forward. "Animals know," she said in a voice weighed down by memory. "They see and hear what we try to forget." Her eyes shone with the reflection of the lanterns now raised high, the flickering light making the old stones appear alive. The murmurs grew louder, whispers tangled with fear. The shepherd's growls rolled through them like thunder. He barked again, a sound so fierce that even the strongest among them felt their knees weaken. It was no ordinary night, no ordinary dog, and certainly no ordinary Coffin. The girl in the blue dress finally lifted her face from her dog's fur. Her tiny voice, fragile but clear, broke through the anxious crowd. "He says someone's inside." The people gasped, their hearts trembling at the innocent certainty in her words. Some shook their heads in denial, others pressed closer, but none could shake the truth of what they had just heard. The shepherd did not stop. He would not stop. And with each bark, each scratch, each restless circle, the weight of mystery deepened. The night no longer belonged to the silence of the dead. It belonged to the cries of a living creature who refused to let them ignore what lay buried. Something was there. Something waiting. Something that would not stay hidden much longer. The barking of the German shepherd carried across the silent cemetery like a warning bell no one could ignore. One by one, people began to drift toward the sound, lanterns in their hands, faces pale in the moonlight. The first to arrive was Mr. Harlan, a farmer whose life had been measured in acres of soil and seasons of crops. His boots were heavy with mud, and his shoulders bent from long years of work, yet his eyes sharpened when he saw the dog clawing at the coffin. "That's no ordinary bark," he muttered. "Animals know things before we do. If he's acting like this, there's a reason." Soon after came Miss Turner, the schoolteacher who had taught nearly every child in the town their first words. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her face pale as her eyes fixed on the half-buried coffin. "My father used to tell me never to step foot near this part of the graveyard," she whispered. "He said the ground here was restless, and some souls never found peace." Her words trembled on the cold air, and the townsfolk who had followed her shivered, though the wind had not yet risen. Grandma May hobbled closer, leaning heavily on the cane that had carried her through her final years. The oldest living resident of the town, her memories stretched farther back than anyone else's. The flickering lantern light caught the silver of her hair, but her voice was steady. "I remember a winter long ago," she said, staring at the exposed wood of the coffin. "A boy went missing, and his poor mother swore she heard his cries near these very stones. We searched for days, but the earth swallowed him whole. No trace, no grave, only sorrow." The crowd fell quiet at her words, as though the ground beneath them could still carry the echo of that mother's grief. By then, Officer Reed had arrived, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the fog. He was a man used to order, someone who believed in rules and reason, yet even he faltered at the sight before him. The shepherd's entire body was stiff, muscles locked, eyes burning as if daring the coffin to reveal its truth. The officer adjusted his cap, but his voice betrayed unease. "What's going on here?" he asked, though he already knew. His gaze never left the dog. The shepherd ignored everything but the coffin. He pawed furiously at the damp wood, his claws scraping, his growls low and steady, vibrating through the earth itself. Bread was offered by Miss Turner, jerky from the farmer's pocket, even a kind call of his name, but the dog refused. He would not eat, would not blink, would not move an inch from the coffin's side. The baby girl in the blue dress clung to his fur, her tiny face pressed against his back, her trust so complete that she seemed to draw courage from his very heartbeat. The murmurs of the townsfolk grew into a storm of whispers. "It isn't right," said one. He knows something. Another shook her head and crossed herself. It's a grave. Leave it alone. The dead don't like to be disturbed. But others leaned closer, lanterns trembling in their hands, curiosity gnawing at their fear. What if it isn't just bones? Someone whispered. What if he's guarding something we've been blind to all these years? The air thickened with debate. Miss Turner insisted the coffin should be left untouched, that opening it would bring misfortune. The farmer argued back, saying he'd seen dogs sense storms long before the clouds appeared, and this was no different. Officer Reed rubbed the back of his neck, torn between law and instinct. Graves are sacred, he reminded them, his voice low. But what if this isn't just a grave? Grandma May raised her cane slightly, her eyes glinting with a knowing sorrow. Better to uncover a painful truth than let it rot in the earth, she said. Secrets buried with the dead have a way of haunting the living. For a long moment, silence pressed down on them all. Only the shepherd's ragged breathing filled the air. Then, in a voice soft but sure, the little girl finally spoke. "He wants you to open it," she said, her words carrying the innocence of a child but the certainty of something greater. Everyone turned to her, startled by her calmness. She stroked the shepherd's head gently, her eyes steady. "Please, listen to him." The farmer lifted his lantern higher, his jaw tightening as if making a choice. "Then we'll need shovels," he said. Miss Turner gasped. "You can't. Do you realize what you're saying? This is madness." But even Officer Reed, who had come ready to maintain order, sighed heavily and nodded. "If there's even a chance something more lies inside that coffin, it's our duty to know. We can't walk away now." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some prayed under their breath, others clutched each other's arms. But the shepherd settled into a posture no one could deny. He lowered his head to the damp wood and whined, his sound filled with sorrow so deep it pierced the night like a cry from another world. No longer did it sound like an animal's impatience. It was grief, pleading, and insistence all at once. Lantern flames swayed as the wind picked up, bending the tall grass that clung to the leaning headstones. The storm had exposed the coffin, but now the living stood at its edge, deciding whether to face whatever truth it held. The little girl's eyes shone in the dim light, her hand never leaving the dog's fur. The shepherd looked up once, his gaze burning into theirs, and the decision was sealed. They would open it. The decision had been made. Nobody spoke it aloud, but the silence that fell over the graveyard carried the weight of it. Lanterns flickered as men hurried back to fetch tools, shovels, crowbars, and hammers clutched in calloused hands. Their boots sank into the damp earth as they returned, the sound of metal rattling against one another echoing strangely among the leaning crosses and cracked gravestones. No one liked the thought of prying open what storms had unearthed, yet here they stood, compelled by the restless bark of a loyal shepherd who refused to surrender the night. The coffin lay half swallowed by the soil, its heavy wooden lid darkened by decades of rain and time. Moss clung to its edges, and the nails, though rusted, still held firm. The storm had exposed its shape, but not its secret. The air smelled of wet earth and old wood, mingled with the sharp tang of fear. The townsfolk formed a circle, their breath visible in the chill, their faces pale but resolved. The shepherd pressed close to the coffin, his paws scraping at the rotted surface, his body tense with a mixture of anger and desperation. His bark split the night, deeper and sharper with each strike of his claws. Every time the men raised their tools, he barked again, as if urging them to hurry. The little girl in the blue dress clung to the edge of Grandma May's skirt, her wide eyes fixed on her dog. She did not cry, did not tremble. Instead, she whispered his name under her breath like a prayer, as though reminding him he was not alone in his struggle. The first strike came from the farmer. He swung his crowbar against the side, and the sound was like thunder cracking through silence. Splinters flew, the wood groaning under the force. The dog lunged forward, barking furiously, pressing his nose against the crack as if to smell what lay inside. Another blow followed, this time from the policeman, his hammer falling with the strength of duty and fear entwined. The coffin shuddered but did not yield. The townsfolk shifted nervously, lanterns trembling in their grip. "Maybe we should stop," Miss Turner whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every superstition she had ever heard about graves that must not be disturbed. But Grandma May shook her head slowly, her eyes locked on the shepherd. "No. The living dog knows something the dead cannot hide. We must finish what we've begun." So they continued. Iron struck against wood, shovels pried against seams that had not seen the light of day for longer than anyone could recall. The nails screeched as they began to loosen, bending against the relentless force. With each sound of tearing wood, the shepherd grew more frantic. He scratched at the widening cracks, his claws catching in splinters, his growl low and steady like a drumbeat of urgency. The baby girl took a step closer, her tiny shoes sinking in the mud, and placed her hand on the dog's back. The shepherd froze for only a moment, glancing at her with eyes full of fire and sorrow, then pressed harder against the coffin, as if he knew he was her shield, her protector. Her presence gave him strength, and in turn, he gave it back to her. The farmer grunted as the crowbar finally wedged under the corner of the lid. With a heave of his shoulders, the wood cracked, a sharp sound that made everyone flinch. A hush fell over the graveyard, the only sound the roar of the wind through the grass and the low growl of the dog. Then came another push, the lid groaning louder now, the rusted nails giving way one by one. "Keep going," Officer Reed ordered, though his voice was quieter than usual. It was as though the weight of centuries pressed down on him, but he did not falter. The men worked together now, crowbars wedged deep, hammers striking, the coffin creaking under their assault. Lantern light danced across their straining faces, shadows flickering wildly across the gravestones, as though the spirits themselves were watching. The shepherd barked louder than ever, his chest heaving, his voice raw. He threw his weight against the coffin, his paws striking where the tools had already weakened the seal. The little girl clapped her small hands together, whispering through the fog of fear, "He's helping, he's helping." And somehow it seemed true. Then, with a sound like a final sigh, the wood gave way. The lid cracked down the middle, splitting open under the combined strength of men and dog. The smell that escaped was heavy and old, dampness mixed with something far deeper, like sorrow sealed away for too long. The shepherd shoved his nose into the gap, whining now instead of growling, his body trembling with an emotion none could name. Lanterns leaned closer, faces straining to see what the coffin held. The crowd pressed forward, hearts pounding, each one afraid of what might be revealed but unable to turn away. The night air grew colder, the silence more suffocating. The baby girl tightened her grip on her dog's fur, her small frame shivering not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. And then, with one last heave, the men pushed the lid back. The seal was broken. The coffin, once hidden and silent, now lay open to the world. The people of the town stood frozen, their breaths caught in their throats, waiting for the truth that would pour out from the darkness within. The shepherd gave a final bark, his voice echoing through the graveyard like a call that could not be ignored. Whatever lay inside had been hidden for too long. Now there would be no turning back. The moment the lid cracked fully open, a rush of foul air burst into the night, so heavy and sour that several townsfolk staggered back, covering their mouths with their hands. It was the smell of years sealed away, the weight of damp earth and something more sinister, decay mingled with sorrow. Lantern flames flickered violently as the draft swept across the circle, and for a breathless instant, no one dared look inside. The shepherd growled low, his ears flat against his head, his eyes burning into the shadows that had been locked away. Grandmame clutched her cane tighter, her voice trembling as she whispered, "That's not the smell of peace. That's the smell of secrets." The crowd leaned forward reluctantly, lanterns stretching out to pierce the coffin's darkness. Everyone expected bones, some remnant of a body left to rest in the earth. But what the light revealed was far stranger and infinitely more chilling. Inside, there was no skeleton, no resting remains of the dead. Instead, the coffin was filled with things that belonged to the living. Torn clothes, folded once with care but now stiff and crumbling with time. Letters bundled with a string that had long since frayed, their ink blurred but still carrying words of someone's hand. A child's toy rested on top of the heap, a small wooden horse, its paint chipped, one leg missing, its empty eye socket staring back at the living with a mute accusation. Gasps rose from the townsfolk. Miss Turner pressed her hand against her lips, her eyes wide. This isn't a grave," she stammered. "It's something else. Something wrong." The farmer lowered his lantern closer, his brow furrowed. "These are not the belongings of someone buried properly. This looks like someone wanted to hide pieces of a life." The shepherd suddenly lifted his head and released a howl that shook the night. It was not a bark, not a warning. It was a sound of mourning, long and raw, filled with an agony that no one could mistake. The baby girl clung to his neck, startled by the cry but refusing to let go, her tiny face pressed into his fur. Her innocence seemed to calm him for a moment, but the howl still echoed in every heart, making the townsfolk's blood run cold. The letters caught Officer Reed's eye, and with shaking hands he reached inside. The paper crumbled as he touched it, but he pulled one free, unfolding it carefully. The lantern light caught faded words, "My dearest child." The ink was blurred, but fragments could be read, phrases of love, of regret, of desperate promises. The policeman swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. These are letters written to a child. Not prayers for the dead. Words meant for someone still breathing at the time they were written. The teacher gasped. Then where is that child now? Why leave their clothes, their toy, their letters in a coffin? The thought was unbearable, the kind that carried whispers of cruelty too great to speak aloud. The grandmother shook her head, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. This was never meant to be a grave. This was meant to bury pain itself. Someone hid these things here, away from eyes that might question, away from hearts that might break. The shepherd pawed at the coffin again, whining, his body trembling as though he could feel the sorrow trapped within. His eyes darted from the letters to the toy to the townsfolk, as though urging them to understand. His instincts, sharper than any human sense, told him this was no simple box of keepsakes. This was a story of suffering, locked away in the earth where no one would find it, until now. The baby girl tilted her head, looking down at the wooden horse. Slowly she reached forward, her tiny fingers brushing its chipped surface. The shepherd whined louder, circling her as if to shield her from the weight of the object. She looked up at the faces around her, her innocent voice breaking the silence. "A child played with this," she said softly. "Why is it in a box all alone?" Her words cut through the crowd like a knife. No one had an answer. The farmer turned away, unable to look. The teacher began to sob quietly, pressing her hands against her eyes. Officer Reed clenched the letter tighter, his knuckles white. The grandmother whispered a prayer under her breath, calling upon mercy for the soul who had left such things behind. Fear deepened. The discovery was worse than bones, worse than death. This coffin carried the weight of a hidden truth, one that generations had avoided but could no longer ignore. The belongings spoke of a child's life, abruptly interrupted, deliberately erased. The letters spoke of love and desperation. The toy spoke of innocence stolen. The shepherd barked again, sharp and urgent, breaking through their grief. He placed his paw firmly on the wooden horse, his eyes glowing with a fire that seemed to pierce through the veil of time. It was as if he was demanding they not just see the objects, but understand the story they carried. His body quivered with the intensity of it, and even the bravest men felt a chill down their spine. The policeman finally found his voice. This was no ordinary burial. Someone used this coffin to hide the truth, to lock away what should have been remembered. He glanced at the dog, who stood tall, chest heaving, eyes unyielding. And he will not let us forget it. The little girl hugged the shepherd tightly, burying her face in his fur. The dog lowered his head toward her, pressing against her in reassurance, as if reminding her that even the darkest secrets can be faced with loyalty and love. Around them, the townsfolk stood frozen, torn between fear and sorrow. The night felt heavier now, the mist pressing closer, as though the cemetery itself held its breath. Whatever story lay inside that coffin was not finished. The shepherd had unearthed more than belongings. He had unearthed a wound buried in the town's heart. And now, standing before the open box, the people realized the truth was no longer hidden. It was staring back at them, demanding to be remembered. The silence that followed the reveal of the belongings was heavy, broken only by the low whines of the German shepherd. His chest rose and fell quickly, his body still pressed close to the coffin, as if he understood better than anyone that the objects inside carried more than dust and time. The townsfolk stared into the box, their faces pale and troubled, but it was the elders among them who finally found their voices. Grandma May leaned on her cane, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. "I know that toy," she whispered, her voice shaking. She reached a trembling hand toward the chipped wooden horse, her fingers stopping just short of touching it. "That belonged to the Miller boy, little Jacob. He went missing over 60 years ago." A gasp rose from the crowd, for many had heard the story whispered, but few believed it was true. Miss Turner, her shawl pulled tightly around her, nodded slowly. "My mother told me about him. She said Jacob would come to school with that very toy tucked in his satchel, holding it like it was his closest friend. And then one day he never came back. They searched for him everywhere, the woods, the river, even the mines. Nothing. His poor mother, she sat at her window for years, waiting. She swore she could hear him crying even when no one else could." The farmer set his lantern on the ground, rubbing his weathered face with both hands. "I was just a boy then, but I remember the search parties. We carried torches through these fields, calling his name until our throats bled. But the earth swallowed him. No grave, no goodbye. Just silence." The crowd shivered as the memories poured out, their voices weaving together the tapestry of a tragedy buried in time. The coffin before them no longer seemed like wooden nails. It was a vessel of grief, a container for every unanswered question that had haunted their town. The letters, the clothes, the toy, they were not random objects. They were fragments of a child's stolen life, hidden deliberately, kept from the eyes of those who had loved him. The shepherd pawed at the earth again, his claws tearing into the soil beneath the coffin as though he knew there was more to be found. His growls rumbled low, his body shaking with urgency. The baby girl in the blue dress crouched beside him, her tiny hands brushing against his fur. She whispered softly, as though lending her small voice to his unspoken demand. The dog dug deeper, dirt flying beneath his paws, his nose pressing against the wood of the coffin's base. And then, with a whimper that rose into a bark, he uncovered something else, something wedged in the damp soil. The farmer bent down quickly, brushing aside the dirt with his rough hands. His eyes widened as he pulled free a second bundle, smaller than the letters but wrapped carefully in a strip of cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Inside was a shoe, a tiny, worn leather shoe, cracked with age but unmistakably belonging to a child. Gasps rose from the crowd once more, some of the women covering their mouths, tears already spilling from their eyes. "That's Jacob's," Grandma May whispered again, her voice nearly breaking. "He wore those shoes every Sunday to church. His mother polished them until they shone, even when the soles were near worn through. I'd know them anywhere." Miss Turner shook her head, her voice barely audible. "All these years, and he was here. Right here. While we walked past this ground, while we told our children stories of a boy lost, he was never lost at all. He was hidden." The shepherd barked again, his voice sharp and echoing through the cemetery, as though scolding the world for its blindness. His howl followed, rising and falling with raw grief that seemed to belong not just to him, but to the whole town. The little girl hugged him tightly, tears welling in her innocent eyes though she didn't fully understand. Children do not need the weight of words to know when sorrow is in the air. The policeman knelt beside the coffin, his flashlight trembling in his hands. "This wasn't an accident," he said grimly. "Someone put these things here. Someone wanted them hidden. Whoever did this didn't want Jacob to be remembered." His words made the crowd shift uneasily, for with them came the realization that this was not only tragedy, it was betrayal. Grandma May lowered her head, her tears falling freely. His mother died without knowing. She went to her grave still waiting for her boy to come home. Her words cracked the silence, leaving everyone with the bitter taste of loss that stretched across generations. The night seemed darker now, the mist thicker, as though the cemetery itself was alive with grief. But within the sorrow there was also something else, a flicker of truth finally uncovered, a wound finally seen. The shepherd had forced them to look, to remember, to face what they had buried not only in the ground but in their hearts. The little girl's voice, small but steady, carried into the silence. "He didn't want Jacob to be alone," she said, stroking her shepherd's head. "That's why he barked." Her innocence stripped the moment of fear and wrapped it in something pure. The townsfolk stood together, bound by the weight of the past and the mystery of the coffin. Their fear had deepened, yes, but so had their understanding. The shepherd's digging had unearthed more than relics. It had uncovered a truth that demanded to be faced, no matter how much it hurt. As the lanterns flickered and the night pressed closer, they realized this was not just the story of a dog, or a coffin, or even a lost boy. It was the story of a community forced to reckon with what it had ignored for too long. And the shepherd, loyal and unrelenting, had become the voice for a child who could no longer speak. The night seemed to still after the discovery of the toy and the shoe, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The townsfolk stood frozen, grief heavy on their shoulders, the shepherd pacing restlessly by the coffin. His growls had softened into whines, but his body remained tense, his ears pricked, nose pressed close to the cracked wood. Something in him refused to stop, refused to let the night end with only sorrow. Then, as the crowd leaned in, straining to hear the whisper of their own hearts, another sound rose from the depths of the coffin. Faint, fragile, unmistakably alive. It was not the creak of wood, nor the shifting of soil. It was softer, more delicate, a whimper. A tiny cry that trembled in the air, so faint that at first they thought it must be their imagination. But then it came again, a weak, pitiful sound, like the call of a creature clinging to life. The shepherd froze, ears sharp, and then exploded into frantic barking. His voice shattered the stillness, sharp and wild, as though he had finally been proven right. He pawed at the coffin with renewed fury, claws digging into the splintered wood, sending dirt and shards flying. The baby girl squealed, clutching at his fur, but even she seemed to understand this was different. This was no ghostly echo of the past. This was something here, now, begging for rescue. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miss Turner's lantern shook in her hand, her voice barely a whisper. "It can't be. There's no way something's alive in there." The farmer stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes locked on the coffin. "I heard it too," he said hoarsely. "By heaven, I swear I did." The shepherd barked louder, his paws pounding the coffin's edge until Officer Reed dropped to his knees beside him. "Stand back," the policeman ordered, though his voice trembled with disbelief. He wedged his crowbar deeper, forcing open the lid as the farmer grabbed his shovel, prying at the side until the wood split wider. Lantern light spilled across the inside of the coffin, illuminating the pile of belongings and the damp cloth. And then, beneath the torn clothes, the sound came again, clearer now, a weak, desperate cry. The shepherd whined, almost howled, pressing his nose deep into the crack, unwilling to move. "Help him!" Grandma May cried, her old voice breaking. "For the love of God, help him!" The men dug quickly, tossing aside the belongings that had been carefully placed inside years ago, their hands shaking, breaths ragged with urgency. The wood splintered further under their strikes, and then, finally, the truth emerged. Beneath the debris, curled in a corner of the coffin, was a small shape. A puppy. Starving, trembling, its ribs sharp beneath its skin, its eyes clouded with fear but still alive. Its whimpers pierced the night, soft and desperate, as though it had been waiting for this moment, for these hands to set it free. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sight was too shocking, too impossible to understand. A coffin, unearthed after decades, filled with relics of a lost child, and somehow, impossibly, a living creature hidden within. Then the shepherd let out a howl that shattered the paralysis, his body lunging forward, nose pressed toward the tiny bundle of life. The farmer reached in first, his rough hands cradling the fragile body as gently as if it were spun from glass. The puppy whimpered, licking his thumb weakly, its body quivering in his palms. The crowd erupted in gasps and cries, disbelief spreading like fire. Some wept openly, tears cutting paths down their cheeks. Others pressed their hands over their mouths, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The baby girl broke free from Grandma May's grasp and hurried forward on unsteady feet. She reached out with both arms, and the farmer, his own hands shaking, lowered the puppy into her embrace. She held it tightly against her chest, rocking it as though it were the most precious treasure in the world. The shepherd circled her protectively, his tail wagging low, his eyes soft but still burning with pride. Miss Turner sobbed into her shawl. "It's a miracle," she whispered. "After all these years of sorrow, after everything this ground has hidden, something has survived." Officer Reed shook his head slowly, his voice thick. "It's not just survival. It's a message. Something was meant to be found tonight." The puppy whimpered again, nuzzling into the little girl's dress, its tiny body trembling as warmth returned to it. She kissed its head, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe now," she said, her innocence wrapping the words in truth. The shepherd pressed his nose against the puppy's side, sniffing, licking gently as though sealing the promise himself. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, lanterns raised high, their faces glowing with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For decades, this cemetery had been a place of whispers, of sorrow, of unanswered questions. And now, in the most unlikely way, life had broken through the soil of grief. A starving puppy, trapped and forgotten, had been given back to the world through the instincts of a loyal dog who refused to be silenced. The grandmother wiped her tears with a trembling hand. "This town has carried too much loss," she said softly. "But tonight we are reminded, hope does not die. It waits in the dark until someone has the courage to uncover it." The shepherd stood tall beside the little girl, his chest rising with each heavy breath, his eyes glowing in the lantern light. The people looked at him differently now, not just as a loyal companion, but as something more. A guardian, a voice for the voiceless, a savior who had unearthed not only secrets of the past but a miracle for the present. And as the baby girl hugged the rescued puppy tighter, her small smile breaking through the night, the townsfolk realized they had witnessed something that would live in their hearts forever. The discovery of the tiny, shivering puppy left the townsfolk stunned, their tears of fear and sorrow mingling now with gasps of wonder. No one knew how such a fragile life had endured in the cold darkness of that coffin, but one truth was clear. It had survived because the shepherd had refused to give up. The crowd, still trembling from the shock, moved quickly now with one mind. The farmer wrapped the puppy gently in his coat, cradling it close to his chest. "It needs warmth," he said, his voice thick with urgency. "If we wait, it won't make it through the night." The people hurried down the muddy path toward the edge of town, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. The shepherd stayed close to the baby girl, his eyes never leaving her as she walked proudly beside the man carrying the fragile creature. Every so often, the little girl reached out a tiny hand to stroke the puppy's head, whispering softly, "It's okay, we're here now." Her innocence seemed to shield the trembling bundle, her voice carrying more comfort than all the coats and lanterns around it. At the small clinic near the center of town, the local vet, an elderly woman named Dr. Collins, was roused from her bed. Her hands, though aged, were steady as she took the puppy into her arms. She placed it on a warm blanket by the fire, wrapping it tightly while murmuring soothing words. "Starved, weak, dehydrated," she said softly, shaking her head. "But it has fight left in it." She fed it a few drops of milk with a small bottle, the liquid disappearing quickly as the tiny creature clung to life. The townsfolk watched in silence, their hearts aching and hopeful at once. The shepherd sat by the fire, his body still tense, as though he refused to rest until he saw the little one safe. The baby girl curled beside him, her blue dress wrinkled from the night's events, her eyes bright with innocent joy as she watched the puppy's chest rise and fall more steadily with each passing moment. When the puppy let out a faint, contented whimper, the room filled with soft sighs of relief. Word spread quickly. By morning, the entire town seemed to know what had happened at the cemetery. People who had long carried sorrow in their hearts felt something stir inside them again. For years they had spoken of loss, of children missing, of graves unmarked, of questions never answered. But now, instead of whispers of despair, they spoke of hope. Out of the soil of grief, life had risen again. The shepherd became the center of every conversation. Men at the mill called him a guardian, women at the market called him an angel, and children ran through the streets pretending to be the dog who barked at shadows until he revealed the truth. For once, the graveyard was not spoken of with fear but with awe. People said, "If not for him, we would never have looked. If not for him, the past would have remained buried." His instincts had cut deeper than reason, leading them not to terror, but to a fragile miracle. The town gathered in the square to honor him. Lanterns were hung high, candles lit at every doorstep, and families brought food and blankets to share. The shepherd stood proudly beside the baby girl, his fur brushed, his amber eyes calm and steady. The rescued puppy, now stronger after its first real meal, tumbled at his paws, its small body clumsy but full of life. Laughter rose as it stumbled over its own legs and wagged its tail for the first time. The little girl's giggles rang through the crowd, high and pure, cutting through the heavy memories that had haunted them for generations. She hugged the puppy tightly, her tiny arms encircling its fragile body, while the shepherd leaned close, licking her cheek as if to remind her that she was the heart of his world. The sight melted even the hardest faces, drawing tears from those who thought they had forgotten how to cry. Grandma May, her voice rough with age, stood in the center of the gathering. She raised her cane slightly, her eyes glimmering with tears. "This dog has done what no man could do," she said softly. "He unearthed not just what was buried in the earth, but what was buried in our hearts. Tonight, we do not carry grief alone. We carry hope together." The crowd murmured in agreement, many bowing their heads, their hands pressed to their hearts. The baby girl twirled with the puppy in her arms, the shepherd circling protectively around her. The three of them, child, loyal guardian, and rescued soul, were like a living picture of what the town had long forgotten, that even in the darkest of places, light could still be found. As the night deepened, the townsfolk lingered, reluctant to let go of the warmth that had been kindled among them. They watched the little girl laugh, the puppy stumble and play, and the shepherd stand tall like a silent sentinel. In that moment, sorrow did not own them. The past had left scars, yes, but it had also given them the strength to cherish what had been saved. The cemetery still loomed on the edge of town, its stones crooked, its grass wild. But it no longer felt only like a place of loss. It had become the place where truth was uncovered, where hope had been given a second chance. And at its heart was a German shepherd who refused to be ignored. The cemetery, once a place whispered about in fear, glowed with gentle light that night. Candles lined the crooked paths, their flames bending in the cool breeze. Flowers, freshly picked from gardens and fields, rested on the ground around the unearthed coffin. Where once there had been only shadows and silence, there was now warmth and togetherness. The townsfolk had gathered not in dread but in unity, their lanterns glowing like stars scattered across the earth. The German shepherd stood proudly at the heart of it all, his strong body still and his watchful eyes calm. Beside him, the baby girl in her blue dress sat cross-legged on the grass, the rescued puppy curled in her lap. She laughed softly as the tiny creature nibbled at her fingers, her giggles rising into the night air like a song. The shepherd leaned down every now and then to lick the puppy gently, as though reminding it that it was safe now, that it belonged. The sight drew smiles and tears alike, for in those small, tender moments lay the hope of the entire town. The people formed a circle around them, holding their candles high. One by one, they began to speak. Mr. Harlan, the farmer, stepped forward first, his deep voice carrying the weight of years. "I've buried more animals than I care to remember, and I've laid loved ones in the ground too. But I've never seen such loyalty as I saw in this dog. He barked and clawed until we listened, until we faced what we had long ignored. Tonight, I believe he's shown us that not all graves are meant to stay silent." Miss Turner, the teacher, wiped her eyes with her shawl before speaking. "When I was a child, I used to be afraid of this place. I thought it was filled with shadows and curses. But now I see it differently. It's not the dead we should fear, it's forgetting them. This shepherd has taught us that memory is a kind of love, and love does not fade even when years pass." Her words drew murmurs of agreement, candles flickering in the stillness. Grandma May, her cane planted firmly in the soil, raised her face to the crowd. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her eyes burned bright. "I told you I remembered the Miller boy. He was lost to us, and his mother carried that grief to her grave. Tonight we remember him properly, and though we cannot change the past, we can honor it. We can say his name aloud and lay flowers for him, so he is not hidden any longer." She bent carefully, laying a small bouquet of wild daisies beside the coffin, her tears falling freely. Officer Reed, his cap pressed against his chest, spoke last. "I've spent my life believing in facts, in order, in things that can be explained. But tonight I saw something beyond reason. I saw a dog refuse food, refuse rest, refuse peace until he uncovered what none of us would have dared to face. Animals see truths we ignore. They hear cries we refuse to believe. And sometimes, they are the ones who lead us back to the light when we are lost in the dark. A hush fell over the gathering, the kind of silence that carries respect rather than fear. The candles flickered, the flowers lay soft against the soil, and in the center of it all sat the baby girl, laughing again as the rescued puppy tumbled clumsily against the shepherd's paws. Her joy was like a balm to the heaviness in every heart, a reminder that life moves forward even after sorrow. The townsfolk looked at one another, and for the first time in many years, they did not see only grief reflected back. They saw strength, compassion, and the possibility of healing. The graveyard, once a place to be avoided, had become a place of gathering, a place where the past and present met not in fear but in remembrance and unity. Sometimes animals see truths that humans ignore. They carry instincts sharper than reason, loyalty stronger than fear, and love deeper than time. And sometimes, through them, light breaks into the darkest places, showing us what we had forgotten to see. The shepherd stretched out on the grass, his body finally at rest. The baby girl leaned against him, her tiny hand resting on his back, while the rescued puppy curled beside them both. Around them, the circle of candles glowed brighter, as though the cemetery itself had been softened, its shadows chased away by love. That night, the town did not leave quickly. They lingered, telling stories of their own, of family members gone, of hardships endured, of moments when hope had nearly been lost but managed to return. And as they spoke, the weight of years seemed to lift, piece by piece, replaced by something gentler. They were no longer a group of individuals haunted by the past. They were a community, bound together by truth, by sorrow shared, and by the miracle of loyalty revealed in the bark of a dog. The night drew on, but no one hurried to snuff out their candles. They glowed in the darkness long after the puppy had fallen asleep and the baby girl's laughter had faded into yawns. The shepherd kept his head lifted, his eyes half closed but still vigilant, the guardian not only of the child he loved but of a town finally willing to remember, to heal, and to hope. The night at the graveyard had ended, but its memory would never leave those who had gathered there. Long after the candles had burned down to wax, people spoke of what they had witnessed. A loyal German shepherd who would not give up, a fragile puppy pulled from the edge of death, and a little girl whose laughter brought light into a place that once only carried shadows. It was not just the rescue of a tiny life they remembered, it was the way that life had changed them all. In the days that followed, the graveyard was no longer avoided. Flowers appeared regularly on the once-forgotten grave, left by hands both old and young. People who had not spoken in years stood together again, sharing stories with gentler voices. What had been a place of fear was now a place of remembrance, healing, and quiet strength. And in the center of it all was the shepherd, the silent guardian who had shown them the truth. The baby girl continued to play by his side, her blue dress fluttering in the wind, her laughter carrying through the streets. She did not understand the depth of what had happened, but her innocence reminded everyone that hope is always strongest in the youngest of hearts. The rescued puppy grew stronger each day, chasing after her with clumsy steps, while the shepherd watched with pride. It was as though the older dog had passed down his courage to the little one, ensuring the bond of loyalty and protection would continue. Loyalty, innocence, and healing, this is what binds us together. A dog's bark, a child's smile, a community's tears, these are the small things that remind us of the greatest truths. Sometimes, animals sense what humans cannot. They see beyond silence, beyond walls, beyond fear. They remind us that love never dies, it only waits to be uncovered. And then, a gentle question, carried like a whisper to the listener's own heart. Do you believe animals sense what humans cannot? Do you believe their loyalty holds truths that we often miss? If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. The camera of the imagination pans outward, showing the graveyard bathed in soft moonlight, the shepherd lying peacefully beside the child and the puppy, the candles still glowing faintly as though unwilling to let the darkness return. It is not the image of sorrow, but of healing. A place once feared has become a place of hope, because one dog refused to be silent. Finally, the voice grows warmer, inviting, like a hand reaching out to the audience. If this story moved your heart, take a moment to leave a comment, to share your thoughts, and to keep the flame of hope alive. And if you wish to hear more stories that remind us of loyalty, love, and second chances, subscribe and join us. Together, we can carry these stories forward, because the world needs more reminders that kindness is never lost. And with that, the story closes, leaving the echo of the shepherd's bark in the distance, not as a warning, but as a promise.